In this lesson, we're going to go ahead and open an example scene and continue working with the LightTracer and see how we can tweak it and fine-tune it in a sort of production setting to get some more experience with it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's open up an example scene here, hit Control O on a keyboard, and we're going to go to LightTracer Example Start. Let's go ahead and open that up. And we have a pretty simple scene here. If we navigate a little bit around this scene, it's a simple room with some skylight windows and some toys here, some objects just strewn about in front of a camera that we have set up here to render, called the render camera. Okay. And if we go out here, we have this strange thing out here, and this is basically a daylight system. We have lighting systems, a daylight system and a sunlight system inside of 3ds Max. Now I know we haven't talked about that yet, but in a further video down the road, I'm going to go ahead and stop and just talk about these daylight systems, how to create them, how to use them, and how to change the parameters and things like that. They can be extremely useful for creating realistic daylight simulations and lighting simulations for your scenes. Very useful for doing architectural scenes, although you can use it for pretty much anything that you want. Okay, this is a pretty simple daylight system. I'm not going to talk about it too much because the settings for it are already set up for this specific scene. So right now we're going to try and focus on the LightTracer. Okay, now let's do a quick render. Hit Shift and Q to do a quick render, and you should end up with something that looks like this. Just a scene that's blown out white, and we just barely get a glimpse of something over here in the far right. We're not sure what it is or what's going on here, but obviously this render is unacceptable. Well, let's go ahead and switch from production mode to iterative mode. And we can also see in the viewport it's set to render camera, and the little lock the viewport button is pushed in, it's turned on. That way all the renders are rendered from this camera that's down here, which is what we want in this case. Okay, so what's going on here and why does this look all blown out white like this? It's pretty simple. Because of our lighting setup, we have to use an exposure control to regulate and control the brightness of the lighting and exposure levels of our scene. So to change that, we can do a couple of things. We can either hit 8 on the keyboard to open up the environment and effects window, or we can click on this little button here with this circle, which essentially does the same thing. So it's just two ways of getting to the same menu. Once we're here, these are the default settings. Under exposure control, we have no exposure control set, so that's what we want to change. Click on the drop down box to open up a list of different exposure control options you can choose, and what we want to go with is logarithmic exposure control. So select that. This little render preview button, if you go ahead and hit that, it'll create a quick little render preview here in this little tiny little rectangle window here. We can see that the preview looks white and blown out, obviously not what we want. Down here under the logarithmic exposure controls, we have different options that are going to help us to control how this exposure control is going to affect our final render. We have color correction, desaturate low levels, and so on and so forth. The one parameter we're interested in is this exterior daylight parameter, so let's go ahead and check mark that on. And now you notice in the preview, it looks a lot better. So let's close this window, we won't need it anymore. Click on render, and there we go. Now we can see something in our scene, and now we have something to work with. As you can see, this looks a lot better than before. Okay, excellent. But we're still not getting realistic lighting, as you can see. This looks kind of like just the global default lighting in our scene, with some shadows being cast from that daylight system that I created that's bringing in sunlight from the outside. So this doesn't look that good. We need to create a more natural look to this, and we're going to use the LightTracer to do that. So let's click on this little teapot icon here to open up the render setup window. Okay, and let's make some changes here. We'll go to the renderer tab and we'll turn off anti-aliasing and we'll turn on enable SSE. Then we're going to go to advanced lighting, and we can see we have no advanced lighting plugin turned on. So let's go to the drop down list and select LightTracer. There we go. Let me move this window over here and just move this one a little bit up and out of the way like that. Okay, so let's start to use some light tracing here to get this to render really nice. The first thing we'll do is we'll increase the number of bounces to 1. We'll also have to reduce our rendering time dramatically. So let's go ahead to the raise per sample, which is set to 250, and knock that down to a mere 32 raise per sample. Let's also change the adaptive sampling settings that we have right now. Let's switch from 16 by 16 to 8 by 8 and switch the subdivide down to from 1 by 1 to 4 by 4 so we get some faster renders here. And now let's go ahead and just do a render and see what we've got. So it's pretty dark. You could see a lot of light blotching, but we have some indirect illumination attempting to take effect in this scene. So what we need to do is start to change and tweak the way that this looks. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the number of bounces to 2, and I'll hit render. Now we're getting something that looks more interesting. We're getting more light bouncing around in the scene, and this looks much more realistic and much more natural. We're not going to increase the number of bounces anymore though, because if we do go past 2, our renders are going to take much longer to calculate, and that's not what we want. Okay, now our cone angle is fine. We're not going to change our ray bias. The main settings we're going to be changing here are the rays per sample and of course the filter size. If we increase this filter size to 5 and we hit render again, we start to sort of blur out and start to fix up that blotching a little bit. Of course, this didn't do such a great job of it. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to start increasing the number of rays per sample. So I'll hit escape to cancel that render out since it doesn't look too good. Let's increase this to 64. Hit render again. And now it's starting to smooth out, starting to look a lot better. Still is blotchy, still doesn't look too good. Let's see what's going on under the hood by using the show samples parameter. So I'm going to go ahead and hit escape to turn that off. I'm going to activate show samples and then I'll render again. And now I'm going to start to skip these renders because they're taking a pretty long time to render. Thanks to the magic of video editing, you don't have to sit there and watch me render this over and over again. I can just skip ahead. Alright? There's a car in the background, so we're going to just do that statement again. Starting again in 3, 2, 1. Thanks to the magic of video editing, you don't have to sit there and watch me render over and over again. Okay, so here's our sampling right now. We're getting plenty of samples in these little tight crevices and detailed areas, which is good. But it doesn't look like we're getting enough samples in these huge, broad, open areas back here, which obviously is not exactly a good thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my initial sample spacing, knock it down to 4, and take my subdivide down to, and let me leave that at 4 and see if I can get away with that. Let me go ahead and hit render again. Now I can see that I'm getting a much more even and a much nicer distribution back here of the rays on this back wall. Okay, now to get that blotchiness to go away, we can increase the filter size, but we should also increase the amount of rays per sample. So let's go ahead and increase that to 128. And let's go ahead and render again and see what we've got. Right, I'm starting to see that some of the blotching is going away, but some of the blotching is still there, which of course is not what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cancel this render by hitting escape on the keyboard. I'm going to take my subdivide down to, and I'm going to knock it down to 2 by 2. It's going to take a little bit longer to render, but it's going to give me better results. Let me render again. Okay, I can already start to see that that's looking much better. I like the lighting in the room. I also like the light distribution. All we have to do is get rid of that splotching, that variance and that blotching artifacting effect that's going on in the scene, and we'll be good to go. So let me go ahead and cancel that render out. Escape on the keyboard again to do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the rays per sample to 256. Again, I like working in powers of 2 for whatever reason. Guess I've been using computers for too long. And I'm going to go ahead and hit render again to see how this looks. Okay, I can start to see that up here I'm starting to get a much nicer looking wall in the background there, which I'm starting to like more, but I can see that there's still some splotching going on back there, which obviously is no good. So I need to start to tweak that and change that. So let me take the filter size here, and well, before I do that I have to cancel this render out, so I'll hit escape. And I'll take the filter size, I'm going to increase it to 10. That's a pretty large size. I don't want to go past that, so I'm going to leave it at 10. I'm going to hit render again, see what I've got. Now, there's one thing that I want to bring to your attention. Very important. It's a little kind of a workflow bug with the Scanline Renderer's LightTracer. Sometimes what happens is, what I did was I increased the filter size and I started to notice that my render was darker and was very blotchy. And you might get confused by that and think, okay, my filter size needs to get bigger and bigger and bigger, or I have to add more rays per sample. Sometimes it's as simple as canceling the render and just hitting render again, and it'll compute the correct solution the second time. I'm not sure what it is. It appears to be some kind of a little render bug there with the LightTracer, where sometimes you have to just cancel a render and hit render again for it to update correctly when you make changes to the filter size or the rays per sample. So just keep that in mind. So this thing is still rendering. Now I can see my walls are looking pretty good. So I'm going to increase the number of rays per sample just so I get a nice final production render that looks great. So I'm going to hit escape just to cancel that render out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the rays per sample to 512. And filter size I'm going to probably keep to 10, which looks pretty good. And that's it. I like my adaptive undersampling parameters. They look pretty good. I'm going to turn show samples off and I'm going to render again. Now this render is going to take a pretty long time to render, so just try to hang in there. Now as I was doing this, I was noticing that the render was coming out a little bit darker than I like. So you can do this next step if you want to. If not, you don't have to do it, but I'm going to do it because I think it just looks better. I'm going to take the rays, knock that back down to 32 so we render pretty fast here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit 8 on the keyboard to open up the environment and effects over here. And under the logarithmic exposure control parameters, I'm going to increase the brightness to 75. And I'm going to hit render and see what that looks like. Okay, this is what I've got. Me personally, I like this render better because it looks nice and nice and bright. Looks much more realistic and has that correct gamma. So I'm going to keep it at this brightness, and now I'm going to go back to the LightTracer and start to get the final production render going. So let me close this environment effects window, and I'm going to go to rays per sample and put that back to 512. And a filter size of 10 just wasn't working too well, so I'm going to increase the filter size to 15, and I'm going to try to render that out and see what I've got. Okay, so that render took approximately 2 minutes and 38 seconds to render, and I know that because down here 3D Max will tell me my rendering time, 2 minutes and 38 seconds, which isn't really that bad. So the render looks pretty nice. It's brightly lit. If this looks too washed out or too bright for you, you can always reduce the brightness of the exposure control in the environment and effects window. Me personally, though, I like this. I think it looks very natural, very much like daylight coming into this room at about 10 a.m. and just brightening everything up and lighting up our entire room. Okay, so there you go. You saw how to use the LightTracer in an actual setting and how to go ahead and tweak it and get it to look good. So we got a pretty good lighting effect here by the LightTracer. We were able to light up this interior space very nicely using just the LightTracer. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and from here on out we're going to continue with the radiosity inside of 3ds Max and see how we can use that to create indirect illumination.